The ship was quiet. That was the first thing anyone noticed when they walked the halls of the USCS Endurance. No weapons humming in their mounts. No targeting systems cycling. No low vibration of charged rail cannons running through the floor and into the bones of anyone who stood still long enough. Just the soft, steady breath of a ship that had been stripped of its teeth and told to smile. Admiral Serena Voss stood at the observation window at the front of the bridge and looked out at Aurelius Prime. It was a station massive, old, built into the bones of a dead asteroid, and it floated in the long shadow of a dying red star. The star gave everything around it a color like dried blood. Voss had noticed that the moment they came out of dark space. She had said nothing about it. She was 63 years old. Her hair was white. Her hands were steady. She had fought in 4 wars and survived things that should have killed her a dozen times. And she had learned, somewhere in the middle of all that living, that the universe did not care about omens. Only people cared about omens. And people were very often wrong. Still, the color of that star bothered her. Behind her, her aide, a young man named Tomas, was reading through the schedule on his tablet for the 3rd time. "The opening session begins in 4 hours," he said. "Ambassador Lisserith has already arrived. The conclave delegates are all present. 17 species." He paused. "That's the whole conclave, Admiral. Every single one of them." "I know," Voss said. "That hasn't happened in over 200 years. Not since the founding accords." "I know that too." She turned from the window. Her uniform was plain. No medals. No rank pins beyond the single stripe on her collar. That had been a deliberate choice. She was not here to impress anyone with what humanity had done. She was here to talk about what humanity could do next, if everyone agreed to stop pointing guns at each other. That was the idea, anyway. The shuttle ride to Aurelius Prime took 20 minutes. Voss sat alone at the front and watched the station grow in the window. Up close, it was beautiful in the way that very old things sometimes are layers of different construction visible in the hull, different materials from different eras, the marks of repair and expansion, and time. Dozens of ships from dozens of species were docked along its arms. Voss scanned them out of habit. No weapons hot, no targeting locks. Everyone had come as asked unarmed, unshielded, trusting. She told herself that was a good sign. Lisserith met her at the docking bay. The Valkyrie were tall, taller than humans, by almost a full meter, with pale silver skin and eyes that were a deep, flat black, like polished stone. They moved slowly and with great care, as if every gesture was something they had practiced. Lisserith was the oldest of her kind on the station, and it showed not in weakness, but in a kind of absolute stillness that made her seem less like a person and more like something carved. She smiled when she saw Voss. The Valkyrie smile was different from a human one. Smaller, controlled. But it reached the eyes, and that was what mattered. "Admiral Voss," she said. Her voice was low and smooth, with an accent that turned every hard consonant into something almost musical. "We are grateful you came." "We're grateful to be here," Voss said, and she meant it. They walked together through the main corridor of Aurelius Prime. It was wide enough for 6 people to walk side by side, and the walls were lined with the flags and seals of every member species of the conclave. Voss looked at them as she passed. 17 species. 17 civilizations. Each of them older than humanity's first city. Each of them watching humanity with an expression that Voss had spent the last 30 years learning to read. They were afraid of her people. They had always been afraid. Humanity had come from nowhere. One small planet, one unremarkable star, and in less than 300 years had expanded to hold 100 star systems. It was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. By conclave standards, it was terrifying. Other species had taken thousands of years to do what humanity had done in 3 centuries. Nobody knew how. Nobody could explain it. And things that could not be explained made the very old and very powerful very nervous. Voss understood all of this. She had been chosen as humanity's representative precisely because she understood it. Her job was not to defend humanity's history. Her job was to make the conclave believe that history was over, that humanity was ready to slow down, to talk, to be a partner rather than a force of nature. The dinner that evening was formal and long. 7 courses, each from a different member species' culinary tradition. Voss ate everything put in front of her, and said the right things, and laughed at the right moments and watched. She was always watching. It was during the 4th course that she noticed the guard rotation had changed. Small thing. Easy to miss. The security personnel cycling through the corridor outside the dining hall were moving on a shorter interval than they had been an hour ago. She did not know the protocol for this station well enough to say with certainty that it was wrong. But it was different. Later, walking back to her guest quarters, she noticed that the public communication terminals in the corridor were dark. All of them. She stopped at one and pressed the activation panel. Nothing. She tried a second. Nothing. She looked at Tomas. He had noticed too. He gave her a small, careful look that said, "I see it." She kept walking. She smiled at a passing conclave official. She said goodnight to the aide who showed her to her door. And then, alone in her quarters, she sat on the edge of the bed and was very still and very quiet and let herself think. It was nothing. It could be nothing. Maintenance. A scheduled blackout. A coincidence. She was a soldier, and soldiers saw threats in shadows. That was the job. It didn't mean the shadows were always real, but she had been in enough rooms where something was wrong to know the feeling. The air sat differently. People moved differently. Eyes moved differently. There was a tension in Aurelius Prime tonight that had not been here when she arrived, and she could not explain it, and she did not like it. She pulled out her personal comm unit, her own, not the station-issued one, and sat with it in her hands for a long moment. Then she wrote a message. Short. Encrypted with a code so old, it was almost certainly not on any conclave intercept list, because no conclave analyst would think anyone still used it. She had used it in her first war, 40 years ago. She had never deleted it. Something is wrong. Prepare. She sent it to Earth. She did not know if it would get through. She did not know if anyone would understand it in time. She did not know what prepare would even mean if she was right and the worst was coming. But she sent it. She lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the station hum around her and thought about peace, what it looked like, what it cost, whether it was real or just a word people used when they were getting ready to do something unforgivable. She was still thinking about it when the door to her quarters opened without a knock, and the light from the corridor outside poured in, and the silhouettes of 4 armed figures filled the frame. She did not run. She did not beg. She sat up slowly and looked at them with the same steady eyes she had used in 4 wars. And she said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Far away, on a Valkyrie terminal deep in the station's communications hub, a technician watched the intercept of her message appear on his screen. He flagged it. Forwarded it. And in a different room, on a different level, Ambassador Lissereth read it, set it down, and gave a very small nod. Then she gave the order. The trap closed. Cleanly. Quietly. As planned. The conclave had made their move, and somewhere in the silence that followed, in the cold dark between the stars, a dead sun the color of dried blood kept burning indifferent, ancient, and utterly unmoved. The fleet came out of dark space at exactly the same moment above 17 different worlds. That was the part that the conclave war planners were most proud of. The coordination. The precision. For a strike of this size, 17 simultaneous assaults across 400 light-years of human-held space, the timing had to be perfect. One world warned early, and the whole plan collapsed. So, they had spent 3 years getting the timing right. And when the moment came, they were, to their credit, perfect. 212 warships above New Carthage, 170 above the Mars colonies, 98 above Kepler, 9. Hundreds more above a dozen other human worlds, each fleet sized to the population beneath it, each carrying the same orders. Overwhelm, pacify, occupy, be done by morning. It had worked 4 times before, on 4 other civilizations. It had never taken longer than 6 hours. Above New Carthage, the Conclave fleet commander, a Grethol officer named Sewell, with 40 years of campaign experience, opened the standard channel and transmitted the standard message. Surrender your military assets. Ground your ships. Do not resist, and your civilian population will not be harmed. You have 1 hour to respond. He sat back and waited. What happened next was not in any of the conclave's models. On the surface of New Carthage, in a farming settlement about 80 kilometers from the capital, a man named Harlan Webb was awake early. He always was. Because the irrigation systems on his land needed checking before the sun got high. He was 57 years old. He had never served in the military. He had a bad knee, a good dog, and 3 adult children who lived in the city. He stepped outside and looked up and saw the conclave fleet hanging in the sky like a second set of stars. He went back inside, made a pot of coffee, and called his neighbor. His neighbor called her brother, who worked at a mining cooperative. The mining cooperative had 4 heavy drilling rigs and a stockpile of industrial explosive charges used for breaking rock. Within 2 hours, without any orders from anyone, without any chain of command, without any permission from any government or military body, 7 farmers and 2 mining workers were on their way into the hills with enough explosive material to do something about the conclave's ground troops when they arrived. They were not soldiers. They had no training, no strategy, no uniforms. What they had was a practical knowledge of the land, a deep and personal objection to being told what to do by people who had crossed 400 light years to do it, and a shared understanding felt rather than spoken that this was their ground, and nobody was taking it without a fight. This story, in 100 different versions, was happening on every human world at the same moment. On the Mars colonies, a 15-year-old girl named Petra Vasquez had been awake all night working on a school project. When the alert came through, she did not evacuate. She pulled up the schematics of the colony's old point defense grid decommissioned 6 years ago, hardware still in place, software simply turned off. She had been inside that system twice before on dares. She knew its architecture, the way she knew her own bedroom. It took her 40 minutes to bring it back online. The first conclave dropship that came in low over the colony perimeter was hit by a defense system that was officially decommissioned and operated by a teenager using a school tablet. It went down hard in the dust 3 kilometers from the main dome. The conclave commander looked at his screen for a long moment and said, in his own language, something that roughly translated to, "That should not exist." On Titan, an old engineer named Royce sat in his kitchen and watched the news feeds from Earth go dark one by one as conclave jamming took hold. He had seen jamming before in the wars, 30 years ago. He knew what came after jamming. He called his grandchildren in from the other room, put them around the kitchen table, and began explaining, calmly and clearly, how to build a signal jammer from the components in a standard home communications unit. Not because they needed a jammer, because they needed to understand that the tools were always there, that the knowledge was always there, that being cut off didn't mean being helpless. It just meant thinking differently. His granddaughter, who was 12, took notes. Commander Sewell waited his hour. No surrender response came. He gave the order for ground troops to begin descent. The first reports came back within 40 minutes. Resistance at Landing Zone 7 civilians, improvised explosive devices, not military grade, but effective. Resistance at Landing Zone 12, some kind of automated defense system that the intelligence files listed as non-functional. Resistance at Landing Zone, 3 small arms fire from a position that his maps identified as an agricultural building. Casualties, light, but consistent. He filed his first report to Conclave High Command. Minor resistance from disorganized civilian elements, proceeding as planned. 2 hours later, he filed a second report. The tone was different. The resistance was no longer disorganized. It was still civilian, still uncoordinated in any traditional military sense, but it was everywhere, it was persistent, and it was learning. Groups that had been scattered were finding each other. Improvised tactics were being refined in real time. Every time his troops cleared a position, the humans had already moved on and set up somewhere new. He had enough troops. He had overwhelming firepower. He had every tactical advantage on paper. But he was fighting something that did not fight the way anything was supposed to fight, and it was making his numbers mean less with every hour. On the Conclave flagship, War Master Domovan stood in front of the tactical display and stared at the reports coming in from all 17 worlds. He was old, 400 years old, ancient even by Grethal standards, and he had studied warfare his entire life. He had read every account of every significant conflict in recorded galactic history. He knew how species broke. He knew the pressure points. He knew the timelines. Everything in front of him was wrong. "They have no coordination," said his aide, reading the same data. "No central command issuing orders. Each resistance cell appears to be acting independently." "Yes," said Domovan. "Then they should be easier to suppress. Uncoordinated resistance collapses faster. It's basic doctrine." Domovan did not answer right away. He was looking at a specific data point, the rate of resistance increase over time on New Carthage. It was not going down. It was going up, with no central command, with no orders from above. The resistance was growing on its own, fed by nothing but the presence of an enemy on the ground. "They don't need coordination," he said slowly, as if working it out as he spoke. "Each individual simply responds to the presence of a threat. They don't wait for instructions. They act." He paused. "We have been suppressing coordinated militaries for 4,000 years. We know how to cut the head off an organization and watch the body stop." He looked at his aide. "This species has no head. Or rather," he stopped. "Sir, every one of them is a head." The aide stared at him. Domovan looked back at the display. 17 worlds. 17 bleeding wounds that were not closing, were not shrinking, were in fact slowly, stubbornly, impossibly getting worse. The plan called for full pacification by the end of day 1. It was now the end of day 1. Not a single world was pacified. He sent his report to Lysareth in plain language, without the usual diplomatic softening. She read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk on Aurelius Prime, in the room where she had given the order less than 24 hours ago, and she looked out the window at the dying red star. The plan was still sound, she told herself. The resistance would break. It always broke. They were farmers and children, and old engineers. They had no supply lines, no orbital support, no military command structure. They would run out of materials and energy and will, and then it would be over. She believed this. She was very intelligent and very experienced, and she believed this completely. She was also, for the first time in a long and decorated life, wrong in a way she did not yet know how to measure. On New Carthage, Harlan Webb came home after dark, sat on his porch, and ate a cold meal. He was tired. His bad knee was worse. 2 of the 7 people who had left with him that morning had not come back. He sat with that for a while, the way you sit with a heavy thing, and then he called his children in the city to make sure they were alive. They were. They had been doing their own version of the same thing. He finished his meal. He looked up at the sky, at the enemy fleet still hanging there like false stars. Then he went inside, slept 4 hours, and got up before dawn, to start again. That was all it was. No glory in it. No grand speech. Just a man getting up in the dark and going back to the work of being impossible to kill. That was all it had ever been. And it was, as the conclave was beginning to understand, more than enough. Commander Elias Dern had never planned to be in charge of anything. That was not false modesty. It was simply true. He was a logistics officer. His entire career had been built around getting the right materials to the right places at the right time. Fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies. He was good at it. He liked it. It was quiet, important, and rarely involved anyone shooting at him. He had been very happy with this arrangement for 9 years. He was 31 years old, and he was now the highest-ranking officer alive in the entire outer human fleet. The ISV Carthage was a frigate medium-sized, fast, built for patrol work rather than heavy combat. It had survived the initial conclave strike through pure accident. It had been running a supply route far out on the edge of human space when the attack came, close enough to receive fragments of the emergency signal, far enough to not be in anyone's crosshairs. When Dern finally got a picture of what had happened assembled from broken transmissions, signal fragments, and one very long, very cold hour of sitting in the dark, piecing things together, he sat in the captain's chair and stared at the floor for a long time. The captain was dead. The executive officer was dead. The senior tactical officer was dead, not on this ship. But they had been at Aurelius Prime for the summit. Most of humanity's senior military leadership had been there, in fact, because the summit had been real enough to be convincing, which was the whole point of a trap. Dern rubbed his face with both hands. Then he looked up at the 15 people watching him from their stations. "All right," he said. "Let's figure out who else is still out there." It took 3 days to find the first other ship. Not because there were no ships, there were. Scattered across a vast area of deep space, running dark to avoid conclave detection, but because all the normal communication channels were either jammed or compromised. Dern's communications officer, a young woman named Sable, spent those 3 days cycling through every frequency she could think of, including several that were technically obsolete and had not been officially used in over a decade. The signal she finally got a response on was a frequency used by old cargo haulers, civilian, barely military, the kind of thing no conclave analyst would be monitoring because there was no reason to. The ship on the other end was the OCV Mira's Grace. It was a civilian transport that had been retrofitted with 2-point defense guns and was now carrying 47 survivors from a destroyed colony station, including 3 active military personnel and a mechanic who had once served in the Navy and apparently still knew how to fire a torpedo. "We heard something moving out here," said the voice on the other end. "Didn't know if it was you or them." "It's us," said Dern. "What's your situation?" "We're alive." "What do you need?" That last question stayed with Dern for a long time. They were on a damaged transport with 47 people and not enough food and 1 working torpedo. Their situation was bad, and the first thing they asked was what they could do to help. Over the following weeks, the Carthage found more ships the same way through old frequencies, through personal transponder codes that individual crew members remembered from past assignments, through a chain of whispered signals passed from one dark ship to another across the quiet of deep space. There was no grand rally point, no official marshalling order. People were simply finding each other the way people do when they are lost and afraid and need to not be alone. And when they found each other, they stayed together. And when they stayed together, they started to think about what to do next. By week 3, Dern had 47 ships. About half were military. The rest were civilian transports, mining vessels, a research ship, 2 long-haul freighters whose crews had simply decided they were not going to do nothing. None of them had received orders. None of them had been told to come. They had come because where else would they go? Dern called a meeting over open channel, everyone together, all 47 ships. He told them what he knew, which was not enough, and what he thought, which was not certain, and what he felt, which he kept short, because he was not that kind of officer. Then he asked if anyone had ideas. They talked for 4 hours. It was during that meeting, listening to a mining ship captain explain how conclave supply lines could be disrupted using asteroid field navigation patterns, that Dern had the first flash of something he did not have a word for. Yet, it was not quite hope. It was something harder than hope. It was the feeling of recognizing that the pieces were there, that the tools were real, that the situation was terrible but not yet, impossible. He had felt something like it once before. As a child, reading history. He had been 12 years old when he first read about the early plagues, the ones before the vaccine networks, before the global medical systems, when a single disease could kill 1/3 of the world's population and nobody knew why or how to stop it. He had read about the people who lived through those times. Not the leaders or the scientists, those came later. He had read about the ordinary people who got up every morning and did what needed to be done even when there was no reason to believe it would be enough. He had read about the ice ages humanity had survived without technology. The mass extinction event that had killed nearly everything on Earth and left a small group of humans. Estimates said maybe 10,000 individuals as the only ones left. 10,000 people, out of which, eventually, 8 billion. Then 20 billion. Then 100 star systems. He thought about that a lot in those weeks. The math of it. The sheer impossible stubbornness of it. Every time the universe had tried to finish humanity, humanity had looked at the situation, found the one small thing it could still do, and done it. Not because it was brave, not because it was special, But because that was what humanity did, it did not have a switch for giving up. The switch had been removed by 100,000 years of hard living, and what was left was a species that simply kept going, in the dark, without orders, without certainty, without any guarantee that it mattered. They had been doing it long before they had spaceships. They would do it long after. By week 6, the fleet was over 100 ships. By week 8, it was closer to 200. People were coming from everywhere surviving military vessels. Yes, but also colony ships that had been retrofitted with salvaged weapons, merchant transports whose crews had voted unanimously to join. One very old destroyer that had been sitting in a civilian museum for 30 years, and whose curator had apparently decided that the occasion justified putting it back in service. The curator was 68 years old. She was now one of Dern's most reliable captains. On week 11, Conclave High Command issued a second broadcast justifying the strike. It went out on every galactic channel, a long, carefully worded explanation of why the Conclave had done what it had done, addressed not to humanity, but to every neutral civilization watching. Humanity was a threat, it said. Humanity's growth rate was unsustainable. The strike had been a necessary and proportionate response to an existential risk to galactic stability. Dern read the broadcast alone in his cabin. He read it twice. He thought about Admiral Voss, the last message she had sent, the one that had started as a warning and ended as a sacrifice. He thought about Harlan Webb on New Carthage, who he had never met, but whose resistance reports he had been receiving for weeks. He thought about Petra Vasquez on Mars, who had brought a dead defense grid back to life with a school tablet. He thought about the 10,000 people who had survived the extinction and become everything that came after. Then he thought about what the Conclave had done, what they had actually done, not what they had told the galaxy they had done. They had invited humanity to peace. They had taken humanity's weapons as a gesture of trust, and then they had killed humanity's leader in a room that was supposed to be safe. He sat with that for a while. Then he called Sable. "I need you to find me something," he said. "The Galactic Broadcast Network, the main relay hub, the one that reaches every civilized world. Find me where it is, and how it's defended." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the Conclave got to tell the galaxy their version of what happened," he said. "I think it's time the galaxy heard ours." But first, there was the matter of the Conclave battle group that had been tracking them for 2 days, 212 warships, moving in formation, closing the distance. Dern looked at his star charts. He looked at his fleet. He looked at the debris field of a shattered moon 3 light hours to their left. He did not have enough ships to win a straight fight. He had never planned to fight a straight fight. He had spent 9 years as a logistics officer, which meant he had spent 9 years thinking about how things move through space, and what happens when they stop moving, and what the variables were when the path through an obstacle was not the one the enemy expected. He picked up the ship-wide comm. "All ships, this is Commander Dern. New heading. I'm sending coordinates. We are going to go very slowly into that debris field, and we are going to make a great deal of noise doing it, and when the Conclave fleet follows us in, we are going to make sure they regret it." He paused. "None of this is official. None of you were ordered here. You all came because you chose to. So I'm asking, not ordering, are you with me?" 46 ships confirmed immediately. The 47th, the old museum destroyer, confirmed last, with a note from its captain that read, "We've been through worse, probably." Dern almost smiled. Almost. He set the heading and watched the debris field grow in the forward window, and he thought, not for the first time, that humanity was a very strange species, fragile and fierce, and completely without sense, dragging itself from one impossible situation to the next, complaining the whole time, and somehow, always, still moving. The Conclave fleet followed them in. What happened next would be discussed in tactical circles across the galaxy for the next 200 years. The Wythran had a saying, very old, that translated roughly as, "The universe does not care about your models. It only cares about what happens." Scholar Vine Lee had taught that saying to her students for 30 years. She had believed it in the abstract, the way you believe things that have not yet been tested against something real. She believed it differently now. She sat in her study on the Wythron homeworld, a quiet, green planet far from human space, far from conclave space, close to nothing of military significance, and watched the reports come in on her terminal. She had been watching for 11 weeks. She had barely left the room. The Wythron were not a military people. They built libraries. They wrote histories. They cataloged the rise and fall of civilizations across the galaxy with the careful, patient energy of a species that had decided, very long ago, that understanding things was more important than controlling them. They had been studying humanity for 60 years, since the first human ships had appeared on the edge of explored space. Vainly had written 2 books about humanity. She had argued, in both of them, that humans were a fascinating but ultimately unstable civilization, brilliant in short bursts, prone to self-destruction, likely to peak within another century, and either collapse or stabilize into something more predictable. She had been confident in this conclusion. She was not confident anymore. She pulled up the latest tactical summary from the outer human systems. Commander Dern's fleet, which had been 47 ships 11 weeks ago, and was now, according to the most recent count, 312, had engaged a conclave battle group of 212 vessels 3 days ago in the debris field of a shattered moon. The battle had lasted 9 hours. The conclave fleet had lost 89 ships. Dern's force had lost 11. The ratio was wrong. By any standard model of fleet engagement, a force of 300 irregular, mixed-class ships, half of them civilian transports with improvised weapons, should not be able to engage a professional conclave battle group and come out ahead by that margin. The models said it couldn't happen. Vine Lee had 3 different models open on her secondary screen. They all agreed. They were all wrong. She began writing in her journal, not the formal academic record, the private one she had kept since she was young. The variable we consistently fail to account for, she wrote, is not technology or numbers or tactics. It is something in the human psychological structure that we do not have a proper term for. They are more effective the worse the situation becomes. I do not know how to model this. I am not sure it can be modeled. She closed the journal and watched the news feeds. She was not the only one watching. On a Dreth colony world, small, quiet, located in a political neutral zone between conclave and non-conclave space, Ambassador Sewell was having a very difficult conversation with himself. The Dreth had been conclave members for 800 years. They had joined willingly, long ago, when the conclave had been younger and its promises had meant something. They had voted against the strike on humanity. They had been the only member species to vote against it, and they had been overruled 17-1, and they had been quietly reminded, afterward, that dissent was tolerated, but consequences were real. Sewell had watched the war for 11 weeks. He had watched humanity's resistance grow from scattered civilian defenders to an organized counteroffensive. He had watched the conclave's confident timeline collapse week by week. And he had thought, every day, about his species' long memory. The Dreth remembered the Kalari. The Kalari had been a small civilization, not aggressive, not expansionist, simply inconveniently located in a region the conclave had wanted. The conclave had called them a stability risk. The conclave had invited them to a summit. The Kalari were gone now. Their worlds were conclave administrative territories. That had been 400 years ago. Sewell had not been born yet, but the Dreth kept records, and the records did not lie, and every Dreth alive knew the story of the Kalari, the way human children knew old fairy tales. Except this fairy tale did not have a comforting ending. He opened a back-channel communication old, encrypted, technically not legal under conclave communication protocols, and sent a message to the ISV Carthage. It contained coordinates, supply line routes, the location of 3 conclave fuel depots that were lightly defended, and at the end, one short line. "We have long memories too, Commander. Use this well." He did not sign his name. He did not need to. Dern received the message and read it 3 times. Then he called his senior staff together, and they spent 4 hours figuring out how to use what they had been given. The conclave, meanwhile, was fracturing. Not publicly, not yet. But in the closed chambers and private communications where real decisions were made, the cracks were widening. The strike had been sold to Conclave member species as a quick, clean operation, 6 hours, full pacification, minimal cost, maximum stability. It was now week 11. Costs were rising. Several member species were asking questions they had not asked before. Quietly, carefully, but asking them. Lycereth was managing it. She was very good at managing things. But management was not the same as resolution. And she was beginning to understand, slowly, in the way that very intelligent people accept uncomfortable truths, that the situation had moved outside the boundary of what she could manage. And then Dern hijacked the Galactic Broadcast Network. It was not a military operation in any traditional sense. He did not destroy anything. He did not attack the relay hub's defenses. He simply found, through Sable's research and 3 weeks of careful preparation, the specific technical frequency on which the GBN's authentication signals ran, and he spoofed it. For 6 hours, before the Conclave's technicians found the intrusion and shut it down, every GBN relay in the galaxy was broadcasting a human signal. It was not propaganda. It was not threats. It was the evidence. First, the intercepted Conclave communications from the 3 years of planning that had led to the summit. The original planning documents, the target lists, the timelines, all of it, translated into 12 galactic languages and presented without comment. Second, the footage from Aurelius Prime, not edited, not narrated, just the security feeds from the summit station, the real ones, not the Conclave's version showing Ambassador Lycereth giving the order, showing the armed personnel entering Admiral Voss's quarters, showing the moment the trap closed. Third, Voss's last transmission, her voice, clear and steady, saying, "Something is wrong. Prepare." 8 words. 11 weeks too late to matter, and somehow, in the silence of 600 listening civilizations, the most important 8 words anyone had spoken in a generation. Fourth, the names of the dead. Not military casualties' names, human names, personal names. The crew of the USCS Endurance, stripped of weapons as a gesture of peace. The delegation staff, the people who had gone to a summit to end a war and had died in a trap instead. 6 hours. Then the Conclave shut it down. But 6 hours was enough. Vinely watched the broadcast from her study, all 6 hours of it, without moving. When it ended, she sat very still for a long time. Then she opened a communication to the Wythran Council, the governing body of her people, which had not issued a political statement about the war in 11 weeks of careful, deliberate neutrality. "I would like to speak to the full council," she said, "as soon as possible." She was not the only one making that call. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, 17 neutral civilization species that had watched the war in silence, careful not to take sides, careful not to involve themselves in something that did not yet concern them, began the diplomatic process of withdrawing recognition from the Conclave. Not military action, not declarations of war, just a quiet, formal, galactic-scale withdrawal of legitimacy. One by one, 17 sets of ambassadors filed paperwork and went home, and the Conclave found itself looking at a galaxy that had shifted while it was busy fighting a war it was supposed to have won already. Lycereth received the reports in one long, sleepless night. She read each one. She set each one down. She did not lose her composure. She had not lost her composure in 400 years of public life, and she was not going to start now. But when the last report came in, and she finally set it down and looked up from her desk, there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. It was not fear. It was something colder than fear. It was the recognition that you had been, at the most fundamental level, wrong, not about tactics, not about planning, not about execution, but about the nature of the thing you were fighting. She had studied humanity for 30 years before ordering the strike. She had read every report, every analysis, every intelligence summary. She had believed she understood what humanity was. She had understood the surface. She had missed everything underneath. In a small cabin on the ISV Carthage, Commander Dern sat with a cup of cold coffee and looked at the response reports coming in from neutral worlds and felt something he had not felt in 11 weeks of constant fear and movement and loss. It was not victory. Not yet. The war was not over. The Conclave still had fleets in human space. People were still dying on 17 worlds. There was a very long road still ahead, and he knew it, and he did not let himself forget it. But the galaxy had seen the truth, and the galaxy had chosen. That was something. In 11 weeks of darkness, it was the first real light. He drank his cold coffee and went back to work. The war did not end with a battle. That was the part that surprised most of the galaxy's historians, the ones who wrote about it later, who tried to find the clean line, the moment it was over, the decisive event. There was no such moment. The Conclave did not break on a single day. It came apart, the way very old structures come apart. Slowly, then all at once. Each piece, making the next piece easier to lose. It started with the supply lines. Using the coordinates the Dreth ambassador had quietly provided, Dern's fleet hit 3 Conclave fuel depots in a single week. Fast strikes, in and out, minimal engagement. The depots were not destroyed, they were emptied. Every resource taken was distributed to human worlds still under occupation. It was not a military masterstroke. It was logistics, which was, after all, what Dern was actually good at. Cut the supply, slow the machine. A Conclave occupation force that couldn't refuel, couldn't maintain position. A force that couldn't maintain position had to choose between holding ground and retreating. Most of them retreated. Not because they were beaten in the field, many of them weren't, not yet, but because the political ground was shifting under every decision their commanders made. Back home, Conclave member species were being asked, publicly and loudly, to justify a war that had been sold as a 6-hour pacification and was now approaching its 6th month. The broadcast had done that. 17 neutral civilizations pulling recognition had done that. The Dreth, emboldened by the shift in galactic opinion, had formally announced their withdrawal from the Conclave. 4 smaller member species followed within 2 weeks. A coalition without unity is just a list of names. The Conclave was becoming a list. When Lysereth finally opened a secure channel to the Carthage and asked for terms, Dern was in the middle of eating a meal for the first time in 16 hours. He set the food aside, took a breath, and composed himself. He had thought about this moment. He had thought about it a great deal. The message he sent back was short. Unconditional dissolution of the Conclave as a political and military body. All member species to stand individual and independent trial before a newly convened galactic court. Immediate withdrawal from all human-held territories. Full accounting of the Kalari disappearance 400 years ago, and of any other civilization similarly managed. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Lysereth asked if he meant all of it, or if it was an opening position. He said he meant all of it. Another long silence. Dern waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned it in logistics. The work of a supply officer was mostly waiting for things to arrive, and worrying about what happened if they didn't. Lysereth accepted the terms. Not immediately. There was a week of back-channel negotiation, of argument among the remaining Conclave members, of one failed attempt by 2 hardline species to restart military operations that Dern's fleet shut down firmly and without drama. But in the end, the terms were accepted, mostly because the alternative was worse, and everyone still at the table knew it. The Galactic Court was proposed, designed, and argued over for the better part of a year. Humanity helped build it. True to Dern's word, humanity did not control it. The court had representatives from 31 species, and humans held 3 seats, the same as any other civilization of comparable size. No more, no less. Dern had insisted on that. He had been very clear about it. Humanity was not trying to rule the galaxy. Humanity had never wanted to rule the galaxy. Humanity had wanted to be left alone to do what it did, which was expand and build, and argue with itself, and occasionally do extraordinary things for reasons nobody could fully explain. What humanity had not wanted, and would not accept, was being told it didn't have the right to exist. That was the line. That had always been the line. On a cold morning, 8 months after the war's end, Commander Elias Dern retired now, officially, though he suspected the title was somewhat honorary at this point, took a transport to the ruins of Aurelius Prime. The station had not been repaired. Nobody had decided yet what to do with it. It floated in the shadow of the dying red star, just as it always had, The same dried blood color in the light, quiet and broken and very still. The docking arm that the Endurance had used was still intact. Dern docked there. He put on an environment suit and walked through the damaged corridors alone. The intersections were cold and airless, lit only by the emergency strips that still ran on residual power. He walked through the main corridor, past the wall where the flags of 17 species had hung. Most of them were gone, torn away in whatever had happened here. A few remained, hanging at odd angles. He walked past them without stopping. He found the room where the summit dinner had been held. One wall was gone, open to space, and the red light of the dying star filled the room with a color that made everything look ancient. The table was still there, long and formal, with chairs still pushed back as if the people sitting in them had just stepped away for a moment. He stood in the doorway for a while. Then he went looking for the thing he had come for. It was in a side corridor near the docking entrance, a small alcove where each delegation had placed a symbolic object, as was traditional at summits of this kind. Most of the alcoves were empty, their objects taken or destroyed. The human alcove was still intact. Whoever had come through here after the attack had either not noticed it or not thought it worth taking. Inside was a small metal plaque, about the size of a book. On one side, a detailed engraving of Earth, the whole planet, the continents and the oceans, the thin line of atmosphere around the edges. On the other side, one line of text. "We come in peace." He stood with it in his gloved hands for a long time. He did not feel angry looking at it. He had expected to feel angry. He had been angry for a very long time, a quiet, useful kind of anger that had kept him moving through 6 months of impossible odds. But standing here, in the cold room where the trap had closed, holding the plaque that humanity had brought as a gesture of good faith, he found that the anger had burned down to something quieter. He put the plaque in his bag and took it home. Scholar Vine Lee of the Withran was one of the 3 founding architects of the Galactic Court. She was also writing a history, the full history, as complete and honest as she could make it, of the war and what led to it. She had been working on it for 2 years. She thought she might be working on it for 10 more. The closing section of the history gave her more trouble than anything else she had written. She drafted it 12 times. Each draft was technically accurate. None of them were right. She was trying to name something that did not have a name yet, and naming unnamed things was the hardest work there was. She finished the final draft on a quiet evening, alone in her study, with a cup of tea going cold on her desk. She called the closing section "The Error." Not humanity's error in trusting the conclave, not the conclave's error in choosing deception. Those were errors, yes, but they were the kind of errors that species made and recovered from. The error she was writing about was older and deeper, and had been sitting in the foundations of galactic civilization for 10,000 years, waiting for the right moment to matter. The error was this: every advanced civilization in the galaxy had looked at humanity and seen the wrong things. They had seen the violence and called it barbarism. They had seen the emotion and called it weakness. They had seen the chaos and called it instability. They had seen a species that seemed to break its own rules constantly, that changed direction without warning, that could not be predicted by any model, that aged quickly and died young, and still managed to cover 100 star systems in 3 centuries. And they had looked at all of this and decided it was a problem to be managed. Not one of them had asked the right question. The right question was not, "What is wrong with humanity?" The right question was, "What does this kind of organism become after 100,000 years of being shaped by hard living? What do you get when you take a species and run it through ice ages and plagues and mass extinction events and wars and famines and every possible version of the universe trying to finish it, and the species survives every single one? What do you get when the only individuals who made it through were the ones who kept going past the point where stopping made sense? You got humans, exactly as they were. Messy, loud, emotional, creative, stubborn, and absolutely, constitutionally, fundamentally incapable of accepting that something was over when they were still alive to argue about it. That was not a weakness. It had never been a weakness. The conclave had promised peace and shot humanity in the back. And in doing so, they had made the most consequential mistake in galactic history Not because of the war it started, but because of what they had failed to understand before starting it. Vine Lee wrote the last lines of the history slowly, choosing each word with care. They promised peace, she wrote, and shot them in the back. And in the silence that followed, when the smoke cleared and the galaxy looked at what was still standing, it found what it had always been too afraid to look at clearly. A species that the universe had tried to end 1,000 times, and 1,000 times had failed. Not because humanity was the strongest, not because it was the smartest, but because somewhere in the very long road from a single fragile planet to the stars, it had lost, or perhaps burned away the part of itself that knew how to stop. They made an enemy of something that did not know how to quit. That was the error. That was always the error. And the galaxy is still learning what that means. She closed the document. The tea was cold. The study was quiet. Outside her window, the stars were out, hundreds of them, each one with worlds around it, each world with its own history and its own future. Somewhere among them, on 100 human worlds, people were going about their days, arguing, building, breaking things, fixing things, going too far and pulling back and going too far again, being exactly what they had always been. She watched the stars for a long time. Then she went to make a fresh cup of tea, and she thought that, all things considered, the galaxy was very lucky that what humanity had wanted after all of it, after every wound and every loss and every impossible mile, was simply to be here. Just to be here. And to keep going. That, in the end, was the most human thing of all.